mentioned that it was time to redo this webinar. It is one of our most watched webinars. I think parents, of course, have a lot of anxiety and trepidation about what is the next step. Many of them realize fantastic gains, a fantastic start, stabilization during their wilderness therapy experience, but as we know with any form of treatment, that treatment is only as good as its follow-up in many cases. So with that, I thought years ago of creating a webinar that gave you some framework, gave you an idea about how to think about aftercare, what kind of questions to ask, how to be an informed consumer, and to give you some broad outlines. One of the reasons that I'm redoing this is because something that was said in a previous webinar was a little bit too specific. I was talking about length of stay regarding aftercare programs, and I want to be very clear to you that while there might be some version of aftercare, some version of best fit aftercare that I have or that I've experienced or that my neighbor has experienced, it doesn't necessarily fit for me, and that's why I implore you to make use of home professionals, specifically educational consultants or placement specialists who are well equipped and up to date with all of the different aftercare needs. So with that preface, let me get right into it. When I think about what happens at Evoke, one of the things that we did to really change programming in wilderness therapy is we went beyond just interrupting a crisis. I think in the old days, in the beginning areas of wilderness therapy, things were at a crisis. And what we know is you don't want to make a long-term decision in a crisis. So it was a time to stabilize and take a deep breath. There was time for assessment. It was a beginning. What we thought of, as I saw the work going in wilderness therapy, is we thought we could get a lot more accomplished in wilderness therapy than just that first step, just that stop, just that pause. It's a time to give a lot of attention and focus for the child, right? You have their attention. There's a kind of intensity that happens in wilderness therapy that's very hard to replicate in other treatment settings. Part of it is the experiential nature. Part of it is that it's often the first step in a process, a dramatic departure for many families from the way things have been going, so you have their attention. Of course, wilderness therapy is a very raw experience. It's uncomfortable. It's an intentional experience, meaning that everything you do there takes work and effort and intention. So you have the child's focus. It's an opportunity for diagnoses in a stable setting. And so when we talk about that, we talk about that in two ways. We talk about it in terms of you can order objective testing, right? A series, a battery of tests. And you can also take advantage of what is an amazing natural observation from our therapists, right? Parents will talk often about how well we get to know your child. And that's in part due to the setting. Sure, we have great therapists, and this setting really does suggest something special, something powerful to be able to see what goes on with children. And of course, we really made an effort to change the model to increase therapeutic change. And when you increase therapeutic change, you do a few things. You move the potential for levels of care. And what I mean by that is some of the clients, some of the students, without going to Evoke therapy programs, would not qualify for or be successful in a certain kind of program. So levels of care change. You have more options. You have options with a higher ceiling and a higher floor for that matter. So if you just go straight to a treatment, to a long-term treatment center, you lose some of those advantages. We look at, in terms of aftercare at Evoke, we look at beginning to see what are the features, what are the characteristics of programs, of programming that your child is responding well to or not responding well to. And in addition, this is very important because we can't meet everybody's needs all the way. There's no perfect program. Part of the process is setting up priorities. What's most important? So you list the needs of the child, and then you list them in order of importance, and you meet as many of those as you can. Lastly, with regards to aftercare, what we're doing when we're in wilderness therapy is we're preparing families and clients and students for the aftercare setting. And by that I mean getting some momentum, getting some basic skills. We move them from resistant to resignation to, in many cases, buy-in, investment in the process. And so as you move them along that continuum, you get a greater investment from the child, which changes, again, the quality, the type of program that they can fit for, that they're a good fit for. So you're preparing the family. And in many cases for families, you're preparing them for the pattern, the kind of process that families go through when their child is away from home at placement. You establish a style of communication, a way of being with each other. There's an adjustment process. Part of what you're doing is you're taking some of the edge off. I think that was always in wilderness therapy. You take some of the sharp edges off of the oppositional or defiant or reactive behavior. Right? You smooth that out a little bit. But you're also doing something else where you're improving locus of control from external, which means what happens to me defines my happiness, my life's meaning, my well-being, to how I deal with it, internal locus of control. It's how I respond to things that matters the most. So part of what we do, we provide a definition for the elements of recommended care after evoked therapy programs. And people always ask, do you guarantee success? First of all, our research is fantastic. If you go to our website and look at our research page, you'll see many research publications, presentations from several of the research studies, follow-up research studies we've done. So the data is there. But secondly, if a parent does their work, if they throw themselves into this process, do their own work during this, I guarantee success in that it will change you. It will change the way you think about the problem. It will change the way you think about your child. You'll have more confidence, clarity, serenity in this process. And parents who rave about, who talk about our program for years after their child is here, aren't always the parents with the greatest outcomes in terms of their child. Many of them are, but they're not always those. They're the ones who have thrown themselves into the work and experienced, recognized a global change for themselves and in all the areas of their life. I want to talk a little bit about placement specialists, specifically educational consultants, and the marriage between their position and the evoked therapist. What we do as therapists is we're not abreast of all of the various programs. We don't go out and visit. We don't make that. We don't have time to do that because we're practicing primary care. So when you come with an educational consultant or a placement specialist, then they have that information. So when you marry our experience and observations of your child with their knowledge of programs, then you have a perfect fit. We rely on each other. I've said this as an example many times of my confidence in the process, that after 10 years of being a wilderness therapist, 10 years, I hired an educational consultant for my son when he needed out-of-home placement. And again, there's a process that they walk you through that's valuable. So we present features, characteristics of programming, of treatment that are effective or not effective with your child, and they match that up with specific program names. A lot of parents want program names for us, and that's really outside of the scope of our practice in many cases. So we rely upon the consultant. When you get names from a consultant, sometimes they'll say, well, what do you have to add to that list? And I say, in essence, that is our list. That list came out of the discussions that I had with the consultants. Some of those discussions happen online with you present. Many of them happen online in another phone call during the week. Parents want to get recommendations from a professional who knows their child, who's with their child. And that's where the translation between our reports to the consultants feed that information. They inform that information, and you are, in essence, getting that. And in many cases, I'll ask somebody when they come up with a name, does it have this feature? Is this therapist a good match in this way? What's the peer culture like there? Because he or she, the client that I'm working with, has these vulnerabilities and these resources. A lot of times consultants might offer you a larger list, right? They might even give you a version of this kind of a presentation, but in many cases they'll narrow it to 3 or 2, sometimes even 1 program. For them, based on the recommendations, is a clear good fit. Oftentimes they're going to offer you 2 or 3, and they're going to give ownership within that range of appropriate programs over to you. Because no program is going to be perfect. Programs are going to make mistakes. There's going to be moments, and part of this process is for you owning it. And part of the question that we get asked often is, how does my therapist feel about this list? And your therapist feels confident in this list, like I said, because this list was created with the therapist and the consultant in relationship. I'll talk a little bit about various aspects of the models that are out there to give you some idea of the landscape. Sometimes consultants will think about it in terms of a two-stage model. Sometimes it's a one-stage model. A lot of programs nowadays have built into them more than one stage. Many successful therapeutic boarding schools and residential treatment centers have their own step-down program. So sometimes it can be in-house in that way. A program that comes after the next program that introduces you more into the community, maybe even getting a job if you're a young adult, or going to school in the community if you're a young adult or an adolescent. There's more freedom in that way. And in that way, they give you, with this safety net, an opportunity to practice the skills, the successes, and the struggles. What is the length of stay? Typically speaking, when we think about wilderness therapy and out-of-home placement aftercare that comes after wilderness therapy, we're thinking typically about 10 to 18 months, somewhere in that range, right around 14 being the average. When I talk to my students, what I say to them on the front end when they're asking a lot of questions about the next step, I say to them, plan on being away from home for at least a year in this process. And I'm not trying to pin them down or push any buttons in an arbitrary sense, but I'm saying, first of all, let go of the outcome. If you focus toward that outcome, you'll lose track of the here and now. Holding your breath, aiming yourself toward the finish line doesn't help you to do your work. Just do your work. So I'm trying to take out of their control that idea of they can kind of manage it. So 1 year, expect that at least to be away from home. It's an important principle to understand that while some of the programs in schools might be more attractive, oftentimes more attractive to the young person, to the young adult or the adolescent, they even are, in many cases, more attractive to the parent. Maybe because the child wants it. Maybe because the parent believes the child has made that much progress, as they often believe they have in wilderness. But there's something about insulation and involvement that I want to speak to. That oftentimes the programs that are more liberal, that are more transitional, that empower the client more, still provide support. They don't insulate the child and the parent from the child. You get exposed to the ups and downs. You get phone calls. Sometimes with young adults even, you get texts in the middle of the night. So while you might think that they've made a lot of progress, ask yourself questions, be open to the process, and don't assume that just because something is appealing on the front end, that it's going to be a better program. Sometimes the tough stuff, the tough step, continuing to provide enough structure around the child and for you and your family can be more helpful. We think about them sometimes in terms of tolerance. Level of care can be understood in terms of tolerance. What kind of difficult acting out behavior, self-harm, relapse is the program capable, the way that it's structured and with the support that they have, how much of it, how capable is it of tolerating that behavior? Will they work with you? Or does it come closer to the end of the continuum where there's a zero tolerance policy? And again, when you get closer to that line, you want to think, what does the client look like on their bad days? You want a program to be appropriate, capable of providing care and structure for a child on one of their worst days, not on their best day. The more opportunities, the more choices there are, the more chances there are for regression. I talk about the juggling analogy all the time when thinking about aftercare. That in wilderness therapy, you learn to juggle 3 balls really well. But then, in the next setting, you're handed 2 or 3 more balls. And that's an entirely different animal to juggle 5 or 6 balls. And most often, in that analogy, one would drop all the balls. Have they forgot how to juggle 3? No. But now that they have 6, They can't hold them all. And so regression is a part of the process. It's a part of the learning process. Importantly, critically, it's important for parents not to think of progress as black and white and simple and linear, but rather to value the lesson, the opportunity that comes out of it. The more anxious we are about it, the less tolerant, the more rigid we are around regression with our children, the research suggests the more difficult the process becomes for the entire family. I talked about this idea of a buffer. In wilderness therapy, in a lot of ways, you're buffered from the daily goings on with your child. You get a report at the end of the week, but you don't get a phone call during a really bad day or a tantrum or a time when your child is shutting down or thinking about quitting. You don't get a phone call then. And that's helpful. That really does kind of model the kind of detachment that can be helpful in these cases. And so when you get that phone call at the end of the week and the therapist is able to synthesize the entire week, that's a pretty significant buffer. Versus if you're getting phone calls and several letters a week like you might be at some of the therapeutic schools and programs that follow. How clinically sophisticated is it? Is one of the questions. What's the academic focus? Is your child a college-bound potential Ivy League or elite school level of academics? That's important. Does that cause them anxiety? Do they have a learning difference? Are they going to be more likely to go to still college but not that level? All of those questions become a part of the assessment and the recommendation. How much parent involvement? Specifically around young adults, I get the question, how much does it matter that the parents are involved if the child is 23, 24, and 25? My experience tells me it still makes a significant difference. Your family still becomes a reference point and an anchor for you. And they can either become a greater resource for you in your life, which we all want, or they can become a liability, which none of us want, or they can become really nothing to you. So when I think about those three positions, I think about developing the family as a greater resource, as an important part. Doesn't mean they're living with you every day. Doesn't mean you're talking to them every day. But it means when you engage, when they need something, when they need to be heard, when they need to problem solve, when they're really struggling, wouldn't it be nice if you had the tools and skills, and family therapy, family involvement builds that? Wouldn't it be nice if you were their first phone call or one of their early phone calls? So it's a question about how systemic is this? How much does the family want to participate? Is it valuable to have less participation because the child is in such an autonomous place and there's really not a lot of systemic issues? Those are all good questions. There's this question about, is it a mental health issue? Is it an addiction issue? Is it both? Finding out, is it truly dual diagnosis? Are they meeting with substance abuse counselors, or are they meeting with a therapist who has experience in treating addicts? Those are all questions you can ask. Is it co-ed? It's often a question, mostly a question with our clients and students, not their parents. I rarely take a position on the value versus the liability of co-ed. It becomes a non-factor. Developmentally, there's justification for single gender because many people that are struggling with mental health issues or addictions are not at the developmental point where developing relationships is appropriate or healthy for them. They need a stronger foundation, a sense of self before they enter into that. Many people in our country, in our society, oftentimes move into relationships before they've developed adequate differentiation. Doesn't mean that they're doomed. It just means that it's difficult to develop that in the context of a relationship. So it's something that's justified to be single gender. And then there might be some programs that offer a co-ed experience so that they can practice. Again, where is your child in their practice? Are they very fragile? Are they hyper cooperative and they need some practice? They need some experience of falling down and picking themselves up? Those are all questions. Schools about 10, 15 years ago started to develop family style, smaller schools. It used to be large emotional growth schools. I actually took this off this webinar this time, but there were these programs called emotional growth schools where they had these very powerful workshops, larger schools, 150 students, clients. But around 15 years ago, they started to tend toward smaller. And there was this blend between therapeutic boarding and residential, which are often synonymous. Residential treatment center, therapeutic boarding school. Residential treatment center historically was more clinical, whereas therapeutic boarding was it looked fairly mainstreamed in terms of its academic schedule, but it had a strong therapeutic support. And now those two are somewhat blended. So schools can range between house sizes of 12 students or clients. Sometimes they'll have 3 or 4 houses. Sometimes they'll be as large as 40 or 50 students. And there's this blend of experiential. They've really borrowed from Willer's therapy. They've seen the effectiveness of it, so they've added experiential, even camping components. Some are doing exercise like track, triathlon, and music. So it's important to understand, what are your child's interests? What do we think is an important passion of theirs to nurture? And are there programs that provide the clinical support that also have those features? So residential treatment center, therapeutic boarding. Therapeutic boarding, there are a few therapeutic boarding schools outside of the United States that provide a cultural immersion. They learn a language. They get involved in a culture that is significantly different than American culture. And in that culture, they learn some of the same values that American families are trying to teach them, but they learn it through a new lens. They even learn an emphasis, in many cases, on family and belonging. Whereas in American culture, especially with young people, there's an emphasis on individuation, on autonomy. So that can be very powerful. Don't underestimate the value of that, even though it can be, on the front end, very scary for a parent to think about going outside of the safety of the United States. But those can be very effective. Many consultants and therapists have had a tremendous amount of success with clients that go to those programs. And then there's the transition piece. The weakest point in anybody's process is the transition. That's why we want to make it seamless. We want to provide as an adequate step down. We don't want huge drop offs. That's why a lot of schools have just evolved to the point. They didn't enter into this theoretically, these schools, but they've realized through experience that we need a transition program. And there are step downs beyond out-of-home placement, like intensive outpatient programs or day schools where the child is living at home. So that can be a step down after out-of-home placement at some point. Some programs are primarily 12-step, therapy light, but really emphasize a 12-step approach. And that would be another thing for your therapist to provide an assessment about. Do we believe that the addiction and recovery model applies to your child? And there might be some. It's probably more like a continuum than it is just simply 2 piles of people. And like I talk about when I teach about the 12 steps, the 12 steps are applicable to everybody in life. And in many ways, it's just a spiritual, emotionally healthy, assertive program. It's a fellowship that supports healthy living and change. So 12-step can be a part of it. And like I said, they've added a lot of experiential components. Also, sober living environment. There's a range of sober living, but sober living is a house for young adults that has a range of programming. Some have very little programming, and all the programming is outsourced. There might be meetings. There's some mentors. There's just a place for people to gather to live where it's a sober environment. Some sober living environments, or extended cares, as they're called in that community, would have a significant amount of programming, therapists, activities, and features. And so sober living is toward the end of the continuum of lower amounts of programming, and then you move along that continuum and you end up in something called extended care, which is in the mental health side equivalent to residential treatment or therapeutic boarding schools. So again, part of this is just about the language and the name. When we look at criteria, some more things to think about is how much of family involvement versus an individual treatment model. Part of it is related to the age, like I said, the diagnostics, family wellness, and how much we see the benefit. How much physical activity is involved, is inherent in this. Is that something that inspires your child, that they need, that they gravitate toward? Is it a more systems-based model, meaning you plug the child into the system, or is it more relationship individualized? Some programs, for example, have a parent weekend where everybody within a certain range of length of stay, the parents all come out. Other programs tailor it, and they don't have a family program, but you come out when it's right for you. And both have their benefit. You can see that, I'm sure. That to visit a program where 20, 30, 40, 50 other parents are there is fantastic. It's community. It's belonging. It's support. But you can also see the value of the individualized model where they don't have those kinds of services, and you're scheduling it when's the exact right time that your family needs. Be aware of the home visits. Again, especially for the young person. The idea of home visits are attractive. And it's a huge, important part of the process for sure to practice, to maybe even experience some regression. But it's not simply optimal in all cases. There are old triggers, old temptations. There are family dynamics that are still raw. There's level of functioning in the child themselves that can dictate how many home visits are part of the process. How much of the work is done in group versus individual therapy? That's a question to ask. Should it be far away from home, close to home? Is being close to home going to be a trigger? Historically, far away from home has been effective. But again, as we think about this idea of increased choices, opportunities for regression, where the child at, the more solid they are, the more you're going to give them those opportunities. It's like the old adage in therapy. Are you a glue as a therapist? Are you thinking of yourself as a glue or a solvent in this situation? Is it a socially challenged population like Asperger's autism spectrum, NLD, immature, younger population? Or is it a socially savvy population? Are they dealing with people that have a high emotional quotient that are maybe dysregulated or have mental health issues, but are incredibly savvy? And then again, like I said, what is the first priority? Because you can't meet every need. There's not a perfect program for every student. Why is my consultant, some of the times I get the question, why is my consultant putting schools on the list that seem to have such a variance in treatment models? Because part of that is kind of assessing where you're at. What do you want? Do you want a greater buffer? Are you going to benefit as a family from having opportunities for regression and more interactions, which will be harder, but also then you can work on your boundaries, on your communication in real time. And then will your therapist give me some additional schools? The answer is, again, we're going to direct you back to the professional at home, this placement specialist or educational consultant that you're working with. And to add to that list doesn't make a lot of sense because that list has been co-created. How do you decide? You ask tough questions. You ask to talk to the therapist if that's important to you. You ask your educational consultant tough questions. You get the parent reference list that all programs have. Ask everybody questions. Trusting the process isn't blind trust. Trusting the process is having some confidence and at the same time doing your work to develop your trust, meaning asking questions, saying how you feel, talking to the admissions folks. Oftentimes, the first people that you talk to, although they're not dealing with your child specifically on a daily basis after the child enters the program, the admissions counselors that you work with in many programs become representative of the style of the program. Are they rigid? Are they flexible? Are they open? Are they accommodating? Again, they might not have the level of sophistication of some of the treatment staff, the frontline treatment staff, but there are certain things that you can start to feel. On your tours of programs, especially with adolescents, talk with students, ask them questions. If you are kept separate from students, clients, that can be a red flag. And it's not like you're unsophisticated so much so that you're not going to realize that some students aren't going to be happy to be there. They're going to be not doing well. That's part of it. But having conversations, looking in their eyes can give you a sense. Why won't professionals give me their best choice, their number one choice in many cases? Because again, they want you to have responsibility. They want you to own it. And sometimes there is not a best choice. Just like there's not a best car. Right? A Lamborghini is not better than a half-ton diesel truck. They can't do the same thing. And so you're often given a range of programs, and within that range, all of the choices are acceptable. Does the child get to choose? Depends on where they're at. It's always nice to hear. Parents ask that question all the time. In young adult cases, in cases with young adults, they're oftentimes going to be given a couple of choices, 2 or 3 choices to choose from, within a range of programs that first, the professionals have recommended, but second, those same programs have been vetted or accepted by the parents themselves, and then they're given to the young adult. Because again, with the young adult, the buy-in is a more important feature because they can leave at any point. Sometimes with adolescents, that can be provided if the child is in the right place. But what I think about with adolescents is this: I always want to hear what they think, what their wants and their needs are. If they're at the point where they're going to get a vote as an adolescent, then oftentimes those are the ones that are saying the most important aspect of aftercare is me. They're not the ones that are saying, I have to have this, I need to have this. If I don't have this, I'm going to be resentful or walk away, or it's not going to work. That's a person that has oftentimes less choice in the matter. So there's an irony there. Money challenges are real. These are all expensive programs. And you can only do what you can do. And you get to decide. So be honest with yourself, honest with the professionals. Tell them what you do and don't have. I think it's important not to talk about one problem when it is another. If you're having a problem with the model, with the idea, then don't make it about money. And if you're having a problem about money, make it about money. And why can't I have more choices? Because they start to dilute. They start to become less and less appropriate, less and less ideal, less and less optimal. Some parents will demand when they find a range of school options that they just can't tolerate. They'll ask for more options. And some professionals will give you more options. And that's an interesting idea, right? Making recommendations that you don't necessarily believe in, but some parents want other options. At the end of the day, own it. Do what you need to do to qualify the program. Pay attention to your gut, to how you feel about everything. And then lastly, you turn it over to the child. You can't get this one perfect. You can do your best, just like everything. You can research. You can talk to people that you trust. You can do all the stuff that I've talked about today. But at the end of the day, you turn it over to your child. And you ask them inherently to be responsible for the outcome. A couple of notes on transition. Simply put, make it seamless. For adolescents, that means as quickly as you can travel there to get there is appropriate. Don't have extra time in between. With young adults, oftentimes they'll transport themselves. Same kind of thing. No home visits, calls to extended families, to girlfriends, to boyfriends. Those don't tend to work. I've seen some of the most stalwart and strong-minded and confident students who've done so well almost come apart because they were exposed to some of those phone calls and some of that extra time. And then look forward to a visit to more time after they've stabilized. Again, noting that transitions are the most vulnerable time for most people. Oftentimes, getting buy-in from your child comes after you close the door to coming home. That goes for any age child. In other words, they won't buy in when they think there's an opportunity to negotiate coming home. It's often best simply to suggest at the beginning of the process that you'll be working with your educational consultant and your Evoke therapist for a recommendation. That's not committing yourself to anything. That's not even saying that you're going to do what they say or what they suggest. But again, ironically, in order to empower the child, to get them to focus on what they can control, there's value in not having them feel like they have control. Control of the outcome. I often would say to children, what if I make a dumb decision? What if I can't see? What if your parents are angry or scared and they make a decision based on that? So the only thing you really can control is how well you do here, how much you grow, how much you open up, how much insight you develop. how many tools you practice and become proficient at. Important, do not sell aftercare to your child. I always tell parents, if you start talking about in a letter or on a phone call all the great things about the final school that you've chosen, then your child is likely to be resistant. So every time you say a positive thing, talk about something you think they might not like. And then when it comes to young adults and you're giving them a couple of options, if you have come to the point where you've accepted the options you're giving them, you can step away. You can say, I prefer this one a little bit more for this way, but I'm not sure that you'll like it more. I talked about the regression and juggling analogy earlier. That applies to all adolescents and young adults. The first stage in aftercare, specifically out-of-home placement, is you're going to see some regression. That's the J curve, right? Where it goes down and then comes back up again. So you kind of have to weather that again. It's going to feel similar to the first stages of wilderness therapy in many cases. Talk to your professionals, talk to your therapist, ask questions, breathe, hold clear lines after you have confidence in the process. You're going to get letters saying this is the wrong place. I'd rather be back at wilderness. These aren't my people. I can do this at home. It's a very, very common set of responses or issues that your child will bring up with parents. And then there'll be another step. There'll be another question. And that discussion will happen in the next placement. Our bias towards aftercare, I wouldn't be surprised if one of you want to ask the question tonight, does every student at Evoke go to an out-of-home placement after Evoke therapy programs, after wilderness therapy? And the question is not all of them, but a large majority. Somewhere, depending upon age, between 60 and 80% go on to another out-of-home placement. If there were better day programs and intensive outpatient programs, those are evening programs of 3 hours a night, 4 or 5 days a week. If there were more programs like that in the country, then maybe there would be a few more that would fit into that quality. That's a level of care that is underutilized in this country. But and then there just aren't a lot of good ones in a lot of communities that are close enough to home that people can live at home. But our bias towards aftercare is not theoretical. I can talk about the theory of change. I can talk about length of stay in the research that shows that length of stay is a huge corollary with improved mental health. I can do all of that. But the fact of the matter is, it's our experience. When I started as a wilderness therapy, when my partners started as wilderness therapy, our bias was towards getting the kids home after wilderness because they did such an amazing amount of work with us. They look so improved. It's fantastic in many cases what they do with us. It was only our experience over time that showed us that in many cases that was still not appropriate. They were still not ready for that. They were still riding the wilderness high. And wilderness is a program that for many people is one of the most successful stages of their life. It's more clinically sophisticated and supportive than most of these other programs. You have a huge buffer, an incredible safety net, a lot of support. So wilderness therapy is fantastic and a fantastic start. It gets people into their first step. It moves them past the pre-contemplation stage in the theory of change. And aftercare matters. Follow-up matters. And if you come to a point in your life as a young person or as a family where out-of-home placement is recommended, in many cases, 16, 17 and older, coming home again won't be a good fit, right? Going on to therapeutic schools and programs and then college, or in the case of young adults, going to therapeutic schools and then living independently is indicated. And you'll have a closeness with your child in that process that won't be dictated by the proximity, by the physical distance. It'll be by the quality of the intimacy of the relationship, the ability to talk, to be heard, to respect each other, to understand each other. Tell your Evoke therapist what you need in terms of recommendations, support, and feedback. right? What do you need for your work? Be open. Be as clear as you can. It's so great when a client can tell me what they need, what kind of feedback, what kind of observations they want from me. That's an easy place to go to with somebody. And be honest with yourself and others about your connections. Ask questions. Ask questions about parent-family involvement, length of stay. Ask the question about how will they make use of the wilderness assessment and the work that was done here. Most programs at this point have recognized that we're not just housing students, overcoming defiance. We're really doing some deep therapeutic work here. So make sure that the follow-up program makes a connection back with the wilderness therapist. Even the wilderness therapist will often have a phone call, an initial phone call with somebody in admissions, but ask your therapist to reach back to the wilderness therapist to get a summary of the work. Like I said, do what you can do. Do all that you can do, and then let it go and turn it over to your child. Own the decision. Don't sell it to them. You know how it is when somebody talks a big movie up and when you have a high expectation, you're almost never able to, the expectations are never met. But if you go in blind, if you go in with a more level-headedness, it's easy to be impressed and excited about the outcome. And then take it one step at a time. This is a hard process. We've been through this. This is for many of you your first time, but take it a step at a time. We will lead you along as we go. All right. If you have any questions, please send them in. I'm going to go over upcoming announcements. We want all families, we ask all families to attend 6 12-step support groups: Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, Nar-Anon, or Alateen for teenagers. You can also go to the NAMI.org website and find free resources and classes in your area. You can listen to or share our podcasts, which are these webinars that are recorded and broadcast the following day and kept in our library. You can, on your iOS or Apple device, search Evoke Therapy Programs on the podcast app. And if you have an Android device, download the SoundCloud app and search Evoke Therapy Programs. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Evoke Therapy. On Facebook, search Evoke Therapy Programs. The Second Nature Alumni Foundation on Facebook is a foundation that was set up by alumni parents to help people who couldn't afford therapy. So look for opportunities to give if you would like there to serve. You can also go to our blog. We post a couple of blogs a week. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available on Amazon or BarnesandNoble.com. You can also find audio versions of those on those websites. If you go to the Parent Alumni Foundation book page through the Amazon Smiles program, the books cost the same prices. These are the books recommended by our therapists, and a percentage of the proceeds goes to the charity to help people who can't afford therapy. All right, we have a host of upcoming parent support groups. I will be in Seattle tomorrow night, Chicago on the 23rd, New York on June 7th, Southern California, Los Angeles area on June 11th, the San Francisco Bay Area on June 12th. The dates and times are there. You can go to our website, or you can email Andrea at evoketherapy.com for more information, locations, and also to RSVP. We have our workshops that we ask all parents, current families to go to. You can combine these with a field visit if your therapist says it's appropriate. It's a multi-family, experiential, psychoeducational, wonderful experience. You get exposed to the field staff, to some outdoor activities, and to some great psychoeducation. May 27th and 28th is our next one at our Entrada location. If you want to do deeper work, we have our upcoming intensives that I run. The next one where we have an opening is Finding You, June 26th through 29th. You can also schedule a private family intensive or a private pursuits program. Pursuits programs are our high adventure fun programs where we do mountaineering, climbing, whitewater rafting, canoeing, basically any outdoor adventure activity you can imagine. Families or young adults. Sober fun, therapeutically supported fun. The goal is to have fun first and to learn about yourself second. How do we find an education consultant? Do they have professional association? What credentials should we look for? A couple of places to go toward. You can go to 2 websites. The Independent Educational Consultant Association is one place. You can also go to the Therapeutic Consulting Association website. So Google Therapeutic Consulting Association, or Independent Educational Consultant Association. Go to one of those two sites. You can also ask your Evoke therapist or the admissions folks at Evoke. They'd be happy to give you a handful of recommendations for consultants in your area that we've had success in working with. So I asked, if I got a family without a consultant, I would often ask them to call a couple of consultants, even if they had already decided they weren't going to hire them. And I would tell them to ask this question: what do you have to add to the process? Again, I wrote a blog on the value of educational consultants, or some of them call themselves therapeutic placement specialists. But I think that it's a fair question to add. What do you add to this process? And in the blog, I talked about, part of it is about placement recommendations, and that's critical and important. But they also provide this kind of golden thread of information. They do quality assurance and advocacy. They provide you an independent source of feedback. Sometimes you might be struggling with what the therapist or the program is doing, and a consultant can independently come to you and say, I'll work on that, you're absolutely right, or they can challenge you and ask you to look at your part in this. Maybe there's a part that you're missing. So there's a lot that they provide in addition to placement recommendations. All right, folks, we have a new webinar, brand new webinar on something called the Hopes and Intentions letter, next Monday, May 22nd at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. The Hopes and Intentions letter is the new impact letter. We've changed the name. We've changed some of the focus after 22 years of doing this. After trying to make small changes along the way, we've decided to make a dramatic change to reflect what we think, number one, is a better representation of the Evoke philosophy of love and compassion first, of understanding the symptoms are covering up wounds, number one, so it's a compassionate perspective, but also we know that the research shows that an approach that is grounded in confrontation or guilt or shame is less effective at evoking change than one that is more compassionate, more objective, less charged, less confrontive. And I did the webinar last night on motivational interviewing. If you want a reference for that, read the third edition of motivational interviewing, or listen to the webinar that I did last night, or the podcast that I did last night. All right, folks. Thanks for joining me tonight. I look forward to the webinar. Looking really forward to the webinar next Monday night. Hope these points of contact are helpful. Take care and have a good evening. Bye-bye.